Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum said on Wednesday that she and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney had agreed to strengthen trade collaboration.
And as countries seek other export markets, that's going to reduce the supply to U.S. markets.
In a pivotal move on Wednesday, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney jointly announced their commitment to fortifying trade relations. This alliance, sparked by a surge in global trade tensions, marks a shift in how nations are recalibrating their trade strategies. As countries pivot to new markets, the reduction in supply to U.S. markets is becoming increasingly evident. But the real cost of these changes isn't confined to the realm of dollars and cents. It's deeply rooted in the erosion of trust. For years, the United States has been seen as a stable, reliable trade partner. However, the tariffs imposed under President Trump's administration are gradually undermining that reputation. Across global supply chains, confidence in the U.S. as a dependable partner is waning, with countries no longer adjusting to U.S. policy shifts, but reevaluating their entire approach. Canada, in particular, provides a striking example of this transition. Initially a reaction to U.S. tariffs, Canada's shift has now become a national strategy aimed at reducing dependence on American goods, services, and markets. The Trudeau administration is focusing on strengthening trade ties with Europe, Mexico, and parts of Asia, as well as pushing for greater self-sufficiency in domestic production. The message emanating from Ottawa is clear. Economic loyalty may be punished, but independence is a necessity. This transformation isn't just a diplomatic concern. It's reshaping the very dynamics of global trade. As confidence in American stability diminishes, countries are reevaluating where they source their goods, whom they trade with, and where they invest for the future. This is evident in Canada's gradual but deliberate steps to shift its focus away from the U.S. market. By strengthening relationships with other global players and emphasizing the importance of local production, Canada is not merely adjusting to the new geopolitical climate, it is proactively laying the groundwork for a more resilient and self-sufficient future. But the change is not just happening in Canada. The growing distrust in the U.S. is taking root across the globe. The tariffs, meant to bolster U.S. manufacturing, have triggered ripple effects far beyond the American borders. In fact, Canada's response to these tariffs is just one example of how countries are reevaluating their trade strategies, seeking to ensure their long-term economic stability in a world where American leadership in trade is becoming less certain. As the global landscape shifts, it becomes clear that the real cost of these tariffs extends far beyond economic loss. It is threatening the very foundation of global trust and cooperation. Whether or not this shift is temporary or marks the beginning of a more significant transformation remains to be seen, but one thing is certain. Canada's recalibration of its trade strategy is a reflection of broader changes that could reshape the global economic order for years to come. As President Trump's tariffs continue to reshape trade dynamics, their effects are becoming unmistakably clear, particularly within the U.S. economy. The latest inflation numbers are a stark confirmation of what many economists had anticipated. Tariffs are driving prices higher, significantly impacting American consumers. In June, the U.S. saw a 2.7% year-over-year increase in inflation, with housing, food, fuel, and durable goods all contributing to the surge. The inflationary pressure is not just a result of global forces but directly tied to the impact of President Trump's trade policies. One of the most telling signs of the growing strain on U.S. consumers is the rising cost of imported goods. The latest Consumer Price Index confirms that the costs of goods affected by tariffs are filtering directly into retail prices. The real pain, however, lies in the predicted increase in import taxes, which Yale's Budget Lab projects could exceed 20% by August, reaching an unprecedented high. The immediate effects of these tariffs were somewhat buffered by early stockpiling. U.S. businesses, anticipating the impact, hurriedly stocked up on goods before the tariffs took effect. This strategy, however, is no longer sustainable. As stockpiles deplete, companies are forced to restock their inventories at the inflated prices caused by tariffs. For American consumers, the impact is now unavoidable. Every trip to the grocery store or retail outlet is a reminder of the hidden costs of these trade policies. But it's not just the price of goods that's been affected. U.S. businesses are also feeling the strain, particularly in sectors like retail and manufacturing. Companies are now faced with the choice of absorbing the costs, passing them on to consumers, or delaying restocking. a strategy that only delays the inevitable. The U.S. retail sector, which depends heavily on imports, has found itself in a difficult position as the cost of goods climbs, putting pressure on profit margins and consumer purchasing power. Interestingly, some U.S. businesses have found a way to push back against these rising costs by turning to alternatives. In Canada, for instance, retailers have taken a stand by quietly phasing out U.S.-grown products. A notable example is a local grocery chain in British Columbia that has not stocked American produce for over 117 days. What began as a minor cut has evolved into a complete phase-out of U.S. food products, reflecting the broader sentiment across Canada. According to Nielsen IQ, the sales of American food products in Canada have dropped by 8.5% by volume in just a few months. In parallel, Canadian tourism into the U.S. has also suffered. Car crossings from Canada into the U.S. in June fell by 33%, marking the sixth consecutive month of decline. Vermont, a state heavily reliant on Canadian tourism, reported a 30 to 50% drop in Canadian visitors. Although some local businesses attempted to counter this by offering discounts and promotions, the decline is more than just a matter of pricing. It's a political stance. Many Canadians are choosing not to visit the U.S. in protest of the aggressive rhetoric they perceive as disrespectful. For the U.S., the effects are twofold. While American consumers are facing higher prices at the checkout, businesses are confronted with fewer choices and rising logistics costs. In the meantime, foreign suppliers are redirecting their exports to markets less affected by U.S. tariffs. Countries like Vietnam, Peru, Egypt, and South Africa are stepping in to fill the gaps left by Canadian and European products. This shift is exacerbating supply chain disruptions, further complicating the already volatile U.S. market. The broader implication is clear: the tariffs intended to shield U.S. industries are actually harming domestic consumers and driving up costs across various sectors. President Trump's claim of success, citing the $64 billion in tariff revenue collected in the second quarter, may hold some appeal in the short term, but these revenues come at a high price. The rising cost of goods, the loss of market confidence, and the ripple effects on manufacturing and retail are beginning to take their toll, not just on consumers, but on the U.S. economy at large. As President Trump's tariff strategy unfolds, it's becoming increasingly clear that the long-term consequences may extend far beyond the immediate economic discomfort faced by U.S. consumers and businesses. While the short-term revenue from tariffs might appear to be a success, the broader impact on the U.S. standing as a global trade leader is undeniable. The cost of these tariffs is not just economic, it is a matter of credibility and trust in U.S. trade policy. Once allies begin to disengage, it's difficult to rebuild those relationships, and this is exactly what is happening with countries like Canada and the EU. Canada's response to the tariffs has been a masterclass in strategic resilience. Rather than retaliate with threats, the Canadian government, led by Prime Minister Mark Carney, has taken a measured, long-term approach to mitigate the damage. This approach is not only about shielding Canadian industries from U.S. policies, but about reshaping Canada's trade landscape to ensure greater independence. In the wake of President Trump's decision to raise tariffs on Canadian steel to 50% in early June, Canada was quick to recognize the existential threat posed to its vital steel industry. Within days of the tariff increase, exports plummeted and jobs were lost. But instead of simply reacting, Canada's leadership seized this moment as an opportunity to rethink its strategy. The government announced a series of structural changes, including implementing strict tariff rate quotas and reshaping its domestic steel market. These measures, intended to insulate Canada from the volatility of U.S. trade actions, signal a more self-sufficient and resilient future for the country's industries. Prime Minister Carney's strategic plan focuses not just on responding to the immediate crisis, but on rebuilding Canada's industrial foundation. The plan includes a $1 billion investment in the Strategic Innovation Fund to modernize Canadian steel production and increase the domestic production of higher-value products. Moreover, the government is providing additional financial support, including $70 million for labor market development, which will help retrain displaced workers and assist them in finding new employment within Canada's evolving industrial landscape. This proactive approach is part of a larger strategy to ensure that Canada's economy is not only resilient, but also less reliant on the unpredictability of U.S. trade policies. The most transformative aspect of Canada's strategy is its emphasis on using Canadian steel for domestic projects. By requiring that government contractors use Canadian-made steel in major infrastructure, housing, and defense projects, the Canadian government is ensuring that its steel industry remains strong and capable of supporting national development. This move is part of a broader shift toward ensuring that Canadian industries can thrive without excessive dependence on U.S. markets. But beyond the immediate impacts on steel, Canada's longer-term strategy also involves diversifying its trade relationships. While Canada has long been a major trading partner with the U.S., it is now making significant moves to deepen ties with other global players. Efforts to finalize a free trade deal with a bloc of South Asian countries are part of this diversification, signaling that Canada is no longer solely dependent on its southern neighbor. The U.S., for its part, is experiencing the growing cost of its isolationist approach. As Canada diversifies its trade relationships and secures new economic partnerships, the U.S. is finding itself on the back foot. Countries that once relied on the U.S. as a stable trade partner are now looking elsewhere for long-term solutions. The EU, for instance, is already drafting a massive $72 billion retaliation list, signaling a growing frustration with U.S. policies. Mexico, too, is continuing its talks with the U.S., but with reduced optimism. The situation has also had a direct impact on the U.S. economy. The 50% tariff on copper, a critical commodity for industries like electronics and electric vehicles, has raised concerns about the future of American manufacturing. With limited domestic refining capacity, the U.S. is becoming increasingly reliant on imports, which are now more expensive due to tariffs. Similarly, the 50% tariff on Brazilian coffee has caused prices to skyrocket, impacting American consumers who rely on affordable imports for their morning caffeine fix. Perhaps the most telling consequence of this trade strategy is the erosion of the U.S. global influence. As countries like Canada and the EU build new partnerships and prioritize trade diversification, the U.S. risks losing its dominant role in global trade. The focus on tariffs, while appealing to certain sectors of the economy, is alienating key allies and pushing them to seek alternatives. For the U.S., this loss of trust could have long-term repercussions that extend far beyond economic matters, influencing its geopolitical standing and its ability to lead in global forums. In conclusion, while President Trump's tariffs may bring short-term gains in the form of increased revenue, the long-term effects are reshaping the global trade landscape in ways that are not immediately visible, but will be felt for years to come. The loss of trust, the growing economic isolation, and the shift in trade patterns are creating a new world order in which the U.S. is no longer the central player it once was. As Canada and other countries pivot to new markets and build more resilient economies, the U.S. must face the reality that trade wars come with a heavy price. And that price is being paid not just in dollars but in lost credibility